What if Julius Caesar's ambition wasn't just about ruling Rome? Julius Caesar, one of history's most famous figures, wasn't only a brilliant military strategist, he was a deeply conflicted individual. His rise to power was fueled by ambition, but also by personal demons, fear, insecurity, and a need for validation. Caesar's story is not just about strategic brilliance, but a man so consumed by his own fears and desires that he couldn't yet see the cost of his own ambition. His internal struggles would shape his reign and ultimately lead to his downfall. Born into the patrician family of the Julii, Caesar's early life wasn't marked by wealth or power. His father died when Caesar was young, and his family wasn't influential. It was this environment that birthed his deep desire to rise above mediocrity. His ambition was not just about gaining power, it was about proving himself to the world. Caesar wanted to leave a legacy, one that would be remembered forever. From an early age, Caesar's path was marked by a relentless drive. As a young man, he demonstrated exceptional ability in both military tactics and political manipulation. But it wasn't just his skills that set him apart. It was his need for power, which went beyond simple ambition. This need grew out of fear of failure, fear of being insignificant. He wasn't just seeking greatness, he was running from the possibility of obscurity. In 60 BC, Caesar forged the first triumvirate, a political alliance with Pompey and Crassus. This move wasn't just about power sharing, it was about control. Caesar wanted to be the dominant figure in Roman politics, and the triumvirate gave him the perfect opportunity to manipulate and outmaneuver Pompey and Crassus. However, Caesar's fear of losing control soon became apparent. His paranoia grew with his success. He couldn't trust anyone, even those closest to him. His alliance with Pompey started to fray, and Caesar became increasingly suspicious of his partner's intentions. This paranoia wasn't just based on external threats. It was rooted in his deep-seated fear of vulnerability. Caesar was obsessed with maintaining power, and his fear of being betrayed led to strained alliances and poor decisions. Caesar's conquest of Gaul solidified his status as Rome's most powerful military leader. His victories were stunning, and his fame grew. But success brought with it a new kind of fear. The more powerful Caesar became, the more he feared losing that power. His growing paranoia led him to surround himself with loyal supporters, but he couldn't shake the feeling that betrayal was just around the corner. Caesar's successes in Gaul made him beloved by the people, but they also made him a target. The Senate began to view him as a threat, and Caesar began to fear the very institution that had once supported him. His increasing distrust of others, and his decision to ignore their advice, were clear signs that his paranoia was growing. Caesar's rise to power wasn't just a result of his military brilliance. It was the culmination of his deep-rooted fears and insecurities. His ambition was intertwined with his need to prove himself, not just to Rome, but to himself. His decisions were shaped by his inner conflicts, his fear of losing control, and his growing paranoia. What started as a desire for power soon became a dangerous obsession, one that would eventually unravel not only his empire, but also his very soul. By 49 BC, Caesar was at the height of his power, but with that power came an ever-growing fear, the fear of betrayal. Caesar's rise had been built on the backs of alliances, first with Pompey and Crassus, and then with his loyal military supporters. But now, the very people who had helped him get to the top were starting to seem like threats. His distrust of Pompey reached a boiling point. Pompey, once his ally, became Caesar's greatest rival. Caesar's paranoia convinced him that Pompey was plotting against him, and the more he feared betrayal, the more aggressive his actions became. Every move Pompey made, every decision by the Senate, seemed like an attack on his power. This fear of losing control over everything he had built led Caesar to make drastic choices. When the Senate ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, he saw it as an existential threat. For Caesar, the Senate was no longer a political institution. It had become a symbol of the forces trying to strip him of his power. In 49 BC, Caesar made one of the most fateful decisions of his life. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army. The phrase, "crossing the Rubicon," has become synonymous with making an irreversible decision, and that's exactly what Caesar did. It was not just a military decision, it was a psychological one. Caesar's fear of losing control, his fear of being stripped of his power, pushed him to take a bold and risky step. In that moment, he gambled everything. By crossing the Rubicon, Caesar not only declared war on Rome, but also sealed his fate. This was a direct result of his growing paranoia and fear of failure. He could not imagine a world in which he was not in charge, and he was willing to sacrifice the stability of Rome for his own survival. The Rubicon was not just a river, it was the point of no return, a line that once crossed would change everything. As Caesar marched towards Rome, the tension between him and Pompey reached its peak. Pompey, who had once been Caesar's ally, now stood against him. The two men had once shared power, but now they were at war for the fate of Rome. Caesar's paranoia intensified as he saw Pompey as the ultimate rival. He could not trust Pompey. He saw him as a threat that had to be eliminated, either through victory or by force. During the campaign, Caesar's paranoia played out in his military decisions. His need for control led him to take extreme measures, trusting only his most loyal officers. He dismissed any suggestions that deviated from his plan, believing that anyone who did not fully support him was either an enemy or a potential traitor. At the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, Caesar achieved a decisive victory over Pompey's forces. But even in victory, his fear of losing control remained. Pompey, though defeated, fled to Egypt, where he would be assassinated. In Caesar's eyes, this was a victory, but it was also a confirmation of the constant threat he felt from others, a threat that only he could manage. Caesar's growing isolation was a direct result of his paranoia. As he eliminated one rival after another, he found himself surrounded only by loyalists, further deepening his sense of distrust. Caesar had no one left to challenge him, but he had also lost the ability to connect with others on a deeper level. This isolation didn't just affect his political decisions. It took a toll on his personal life as well. Caesar's fear of betrayal led him to make choices that alienated those who might have been his allies. His inability to trust anyone, even those who were closest to him, made him more erratic and volatile in his actions. By the time Caesar declared himself dictator for life in 44 BC, his paranoia had consumed him. His decisions, once calculated and strategic, became more impulsive, driven by an overwhelming need to maintain power at any cost. And while his empire grew, so did the cracks in his leadership, his inability to trust anyone, his obsession with control, and his fear of losing it all were now his greatest weaknesses. Caesar's rise to power was not just a triumph of military strategy and political acumen. It was also the result of a man consumed by fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being betrayed, and fear of failure. His growing paranoia shaped not only his decisions but his relationships and ultimately his downfall. His need for absolute control led him to make irrational decisions, and it was this very fear of losing power that would seal his fate. After crossing the Rubicon and plunging into civil war, Caesar's military genius was on full display. His victory at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC, where he decisively defeated Pompey, is often seen as the pinnacle of his military career. But underneath the triumph lay a deeper, more dangerous flaw: his overconfidence. In the aftermath of Pharsalus, Caesar believed that his victory over Pompey had sealed his dominance. He underestimated the impact of his actions on both his political opponents and his own psychological state. Caesar's growing belief in his invincibility, a result of his success and his internal paranoia, blinded him to the real risks of his decisions. This overconfidence led him to dismiss any alternative viewpoints. His trusted officers began to notice his tendency to ignore advice and forge ahead with decisions driven solely by his need for control. His constant fear of losing power made him hyper-focused on immediate victories, yet he failed to see the bigger picture, the long-term consequences of his actions. As Caesar's power grew, so did his paranoia. The more victories he won, the more he feared betrayal. The very nature of his political and military dominance built on manipulation, power plays, and alliances left him constantly on edge. He began to see potential traitors even in those closest to him. In Rome, the political elite, including the Senate, became increasingly hostile towards him. His constant surveillance of allies, forced loyalty oaths, and his ever-growing circle of loyalists were symptoms of his deteriorating trust. Caesar's need for control and fear of conspiracies led him to make drastic and often unnecessary decisions. His strategic brilliance, once evident in his handling of the Gallic Wars and Civil War, now became clouded by his inability to trust anyone. This paranoia was not just about political rivals, it also extended to his personal relationships. Even his most loyal supporters became targets for suspicion. His closest advisors and generals, like Mark Antony, were increasingly sidelined by his growing distrust. As a result, the unity of his command began to fracture, and his ability to make sound, collective, strategic decisions was compromised. The more power Caesar accumulated, the more isolated he became. His paranoia peaked in the months leading up to his assassination. Caesar's decision to declare himself dictator for life in 44 BC was a direct reflection of his internal conflict. It was not just a political move, it was a desperate attempt to solidify control and protect himself from the ever-present threat of betrayal. Despite his political success, Caesar's paranoia began to undermine his leadership. His repeated disregard for the Senate and the elites who once supported him had alienated key figures in Roman society. But Caesar, consumed by his fear of losing power, refused to back down. He saw any compromise as a threat to his survival, which only pushed him further into isolation. His paranoia culminated in a fatal mistake. He underestimated the growing discontent among those closest to him. A group of senators, including Brutus and Cassius, who had once been his allies, formed a conspiracy to assassinate him. They saw his rise to absolute power as a direct threat to the Republic and its ideals. Caesar, in his hubris and paranoia, failed to recognize the danger until it was too late. The day Caesar was assassinated, March 15th, 44 BCU, the infamous Ides of March was not just the end of his reign, but the manifestation of his greatest strategic failure. It was not that Caesar could not foresee the possibility of assassination. It was that he could not accept it. His fear of losing control was so pervasive that he became blind to the fact that his closest allies were planning his death. His final moments were marked by a tragic irony. Caesar had been betrayed not by an enemy, but by those he trusted most. He had surrounded himself with loyal followers, but his obsession with control and his inability to build genuine relationships led him to misread the situation entirely. His own internal battles, his struggle to maintain power, and his refusal to trust anyone had led him into a trap of his own making. Caesar's downfall wasn't just a result of military mistakes or political miscalculations. It was the inevitable consequence of his internal struggles. His overconfidence, coupled with his growing paranoia, blinded him to the real threats around him. The more he sought to control, the more he isolated himself. Ultimately, his strategic genius, once so decisive, became tainted by his inability to trust and his fear of losing everything. In the years leading up to his assassination, Julius Caesar became more than just a ruler. He became a symbol of absolute power. His declaration of being dictator for life in 44 BC marked a turning point. To many, this was the final sign of Caesar's transformation from a brilliant military leader to a man obsessed with consolidating power. His psychological need to dominate every aspect of Roman life became his greatest weakness. While Caesar believed that making himself the sole, unchallenged ruler of Rome would secure his legacy, it also made him an ever-growing target for those who feared that Rome would lose its republic. His refusal to step down from power created an increasing tension in the Senate, where whispers of conspiracy began to spread. Caesar's fear of being betrayed had led him to constantly manipulate and control the political system. He isolated himself from the very people who helped him rise to power. He alienated the Senate, once the heart of Roman governance, making them feel powerless in his presence. His paranoia about losing control had become so intense that he failed to recognize the growing resentment brewing beneath the surface. The conspiracy and growing resistance behind closed doors, a group of senators began to plot against Caesar. The group was led by Brutus, whom Caesar considered a friend, and Cassius, who had long been critical of Caesar's rise. They saw Caesar's increasing power as the death of the Republic and its values. The decision to assassinate Caesar wasn't simply about his political actions. It was about preserving the traditions of Rome that Caesar's reign seemed to be erasing. For Caesar, the conspiracy was a betrayal that he could never have imagined. His fear of betrayal, which had controlled much of his life, was now fully realized. His closest allies were no longer loyal. His assassination plot was not just the result of his political enemies. It was a reflection of his own psychological unraveling. He had pushed away those who might have been his greatest supporters, ultimately leading to his death at the hands of those he trusted most. The Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BC, marked the culmination of all of Caesar's internal struggles and external challenges. The day of his death began like any other, but for Caesar, it would be his final reckoning. As he made his way to the Senate, he was warned by a soothsayer, famously saying, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar, though, brushed it off, his confidence in his invincibility blinding him to the danger lurking around him. At the Senate, the conspirators, including Brutus and Cassius, surrounded him. The moment of his death was brutal, a coordinated attack that saw Caesar stabbed multiple times. Despite his overwhelming power, Caesar was unable to defend himself. The last blow, delivered by Brutus, whom Caesar considered a friend, is said to have been the most symbolic. "Et tu, Brute," Caesar allegedly said, his final words expressing shock and disbelief that someone so close to him had turned against him. This was not just a political assassination, it was a psychological betrayal that tore Caesar apart. His fear of losing control and his inability to trust those around him led directly to his tragic end. His death was the culmination of everything he had feared: the loss of power, the loss of control, and the ultimate betrayal by those he trusted most. Caesar's assassination didn't lead to the restoration of the Roman Republic as his murderers had hoped. Instead, it plunged Rome into further chaos. His death left a vacuum of power, and the question of who would replace him was soon answered by his grandnephew and adopted son, Octavian, later known as Augustus. The death of Caesar was the death of the Roman Republic. What followed was the rise of the Roman Empire, with Augustus as its first emperor. The very institutions that Caesar had tried to reform and control were dismantled by those who followed him, and Rome entered a new era of imperial rule. Ironically, the conspirators who had hoped to restore Roman freedom had set the stage for an even more centralized and autocratic system. For the Roman people, Caesar's assassination left a legacy of uncertainty. His death marked the end of the dream for a republic in which power was divided and balanced. Instead, the empire that followed was one ruled by emperors, and the political landscape of Rome would never be the same. Caesar's assassination was not just the end of his reign, it was the end of an era. His paranoia, fears, and struggles with trust had ultimately led him to alienate the very people who could have supported him. The irony is that Caesar's fear of losing control and his constant need to consolidate power pushed him to make decisions that sealed his own fate. The betrayal by those closest to him, whom he thought he could trust, became his greatest tragedy, a tragedy that forever altered the course of Roman history. The death of Julius Caesar did not bring the peace and restoration of the Roman Republic that his assassins had hoped for. Instead, it led to chaos, as power struggles erupted between his supporters and those who opposed him. Caesar's murder triggered a series of civil wars, as each faction fought to control the empire in the wake of his death. Caesar's assassination, ironically, marked the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic. Though the conspirators believed they were restoring the traditional values of the Republic, they failed to understand the underlying shifts that had taken place. Caesar's rule had already transformed Rome beyond recognition, and his death only accelerated the rise of imperial rule. The idea of a balanced republic was now a distant memory, and it was clear that Rome would never return to its previous form. In the wake of Caesar's assassination, his adopted son and heir, Octavian, later Augustus, swiftly moved to consolidate power. The civil wars that followed Caesar's death ultimately ended with Augustus becoming the first emperor of Rome. The Republic was gone, and Caesar's assassination had paved the way for the imperial system that would dominate Rome for centuries to come. But Caesar's legacy was more than just the political and military changes he brought to Rome. His psychological influence, his need for control, his fears, and his obsession with power, left an indelible mark on Rome. Augustus, while more calculating and less driven by emotional impulses than Caesar, inherited much of his adoptive father's vision of a centralized, absolute rule. Caesar's obsession with maintaining power had set in motion a process that led to the birth of the Roman Empire. Ironically, his downfall, caused by his inability to trust, his paranoia, and his drive for absolute control, directly contributed to the establishment of an autocratic system, something Caesar himself had fought to create. Julius Caesar remains one of history's most contradictory figures. On the one hand, he was a visionary leader who reshaped Rome, expanding its territories and pushing the boundaries of what the Republic could achieve. His military genius and political acumen allowed him to dominate Rome and the known world. But on the other hand, his inner struggles, his narcissism, fear of betrayal, and obsessive drive for control, were his undoing. What made Caesar such a complex and tragic figure was the interplay between his greatness and his personal flaws. His ambition drove him to conquer vast territories, but it also isolated him from those who could have supported him. His fear of losing control led him to make decisions that not only destroyed his relationships, but also set in motion the events that would bring about the end of the Republic. Caesar's assassination revealed the deep divisions within Roman society and the fragility of his power. The Republic, which had lasted for centuries, was never the same after his death. His reign marked the end of the old ways and the beginning of a new era, one that would see Rome transformed into an empire ruled by emperors, starting with Augustus. Could Julius Caesar have ruled Rome without falling victim to his own psychological flaws? What if he had learned to trust those around him, to acknowledge his vulnerabilities instead of trying to control everything? Would he have been able to build a lasting legacy that was not tainted by betrayal and paranoia? The truth is, Caesar's downfall was likely inevitable given his nature. His drive for power and his inability to trust others made him increasingly isolated, and his fear of losing control blinded him to the larger threats that were emerging within his own ranks. His internal battles, his struggle between his narcissistic ambition and his fear of failure, led to decisions that ultimately led to his assassination. In the end, Caesar's legacy is one of contradictions. He was a conqueror, a visionary, and a man consumed by his own need for power. His death marked the end of an era, but his influence on Rome and the world would be felt for centuries to come. Julius Caesar's life and death are a poignant reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the internal conflicts that can drive even the greatest leaders to their downfall. His rise to power was unmatched, but his personal flaws, his paranoia, his fear of betrayal, and his obsessive need for control became the very things that led to his demise. Caesar's legacy is both a triumph and a tragedy, a testament to the complexities of human nature and the cost of ambition. His death changed the course of history, setting in motion the rise of the Roman Empire and the end of the Roman Republic. And in the end, Caesar's greatest enemy wasn't just the Senate or his military rivals. It was his own mind, consumed by fear, paranoia, and an insatiable thirst for power.